Meet David. He is 34 years old. Suburb outside Columbus, Ohio. Good job. 6 figures, actually. A house on a quiet street. A truck in the driveway. A phone in his pocket, and a life that, from the outside, looks exactly like what success is supposed to look like. By every visible measure, David made it. But there is something quietly unusual about David's situation. Something that wouldn't have been true for someone who looked exactly like him 40 years ago. Something that almost nobody talks about, because it has become so ordinary that it barely registers as a fact anymore. David earns 6 figures, and David owns almost nothing. Ownership has a simple test. Can you stop paying for it and keep it? Try that with David's house. Try it with the truck, the phone on the financing plan, the software subscription, the music that lives in the cloud, the television shows that exist only as long as the streaming service exists and the account stays active. If he cancels Netflix, nothing remains. If he cancels Photoshop, the files are still there, but the program to open them is gone. Miss enough mortgage payments and the house, the one with his name on the deed, is taken. Look around the room you are sitting in right now. Count how many things in that room stop working if you stop paying this month. Not things that would eventually break or run out. Things that would stop immediately. Services that would terminate. Access that would be revoked. The number is probably higher than you think. David is not an edge case. He is not a cautionary tale. By most measures, he is doing better than average, which makes the question harder to dismiss. How much of what Americans call theirs actually belongs to them? Not in the dramatic sense. Not in a way that feels like a crisis. It doesn't feel like anything. It feels like Tuesday. It feels like normal life. And that is precisely the thing worth examining. Because normal life didn't always work this way. The architecture of everyday existence was quietly rebuilt around a different logic, over decades, in ways so gradual that most people lived through the entire transformation without noticing what was actually changing beneath them. The story begins not with a collapse, but with a promise. After the Second World War, the 30-year mortgage became the mechanism through which a generation built something resembling permanent wealth. The logic was straightforward. You borrow against future earnings. You acquire something that appreciates over time. And 30 years later, quietly and without drama, the debt ends and the asset remains. Unconditionally yours. Something that could be passed down, borrowed against, or simply inhabited without obligation. That word, permanently, carried weight. That was the point. But, embedded in that original structure was a seed. The monthly payment, rather than the total price, had become the primary unit of financial thinking. And that single shift, from what does this cost to what is the monthly payment, would quietly expand for the next 7 decades until it consumed almost everything. Cars followed. Then credit cards. In 1958, Bank of America mailed 60,000 unsolicited active credit cards to the residents of Fresno, California. Not applications, cards, active accounts, placed directly into the hands of strangers. And people used them, which told the financial industry something it would not forget. Ordinary people would use credit that was simply made available to them. Within a decade, the model had spread across the country. By the 1980s, financial deregulation had made lending dramatically more profitable. Interest rate ceilings were lifted. Banks could originate loans, package them, sell them as investment products, and originate again. The incentive to lend carefully was gradually replaced by the incentive to lend prolifically. And the products multiplied accordingly. Then the digital economy arrived, and did something the mortgage industry never could. It eliminated ownership from entire categories of life, without anyone quite noticing the moment it happened. Adobe converted its software from a product you purchased to a subscription you rented. Microsoft followed. Then, dozens of others. The logic wasn't complicated. A customer who had paid once was a customer you had to re-win with every product cycle. A customer on a subscription was retained by default, by inertia, by the friction of cancellation, by the fact that staying required nothing, while leaving required effort. Netflix, Spotify, Amazon Prime, Apple One, the gym membership, the cloud storage plan, each one arriving individually, spaced out over years, each making sense in isolation. And then the model moved into physical objects. BMW introduced a subscription for heated seats. Not the hardware, which was already physically installed in every vehicle off the lot. The subscription was for software permission to use the hardware you were already sitting on. Peloton sold a piece of exercise equipment and then required a monthly fee to access the programming that made the equipment functional. Home security systems, smart locks. Even mattress companies began experimenting with sleep tracking subscriptions tied to monthly fees. By 2023, buy now, pay later platforms had expanded into grocery purchases. Americans were financing food, not in any abstract institutional sense. In the direct transactional sense of choosing to pay for a single grocery order in 4 installments spread across 6 weeks. The trajectory was not random. It followed a logic. And that logic had financial incentives behind it that were, by this point, nearly invisible to the people living inside the system. 3 forces built this world. The first was financialization. Beginning in the 1970s, the American economy began shifting its center of gravity from making things to financing things. Economists use the term financialization to describe what happens when financial motives and financial instruments penetrate not just markets but ordinary life. When the question stops being how do we produce something and becomes how do we structure the payment for something. In practical terms, what financialization meant was this. The interest on David's truck payment was more profitable for the lender than the truck itself was for the manufacturer. The monthly subscription was more defensible revenue than any one-time sale could ever be. The economy developed a structural incentive to expand the universe of things that could be financed, and an equally structural incentive to keep people paying indefinitely rather than accumulating ownership and exiting the cycle. The second force was advertising, and specifically, what advertising stopped talking about. Early 20th century advertising was largely informational. It told you a product existed and explained what it did. By mid-century, it became emotional. It stopped selling products and started selling identities. You were not buying a car, you were buying freedom. You were not buying a house. You were buying arrival, permanence, the visible evidence that you had made something of yourself. The emotional architecture of advertising made the monthly payment psychologically invisible because the story being told was never about the payment. It was always about the feeling. And feelings, unlike balance sheets, do not compound interest. The third force was the normalization of payment itself. When everyone around you is making payments, payments stop feeling like debt. They feel like the price of things. The mortgage payment becomes the price of having a home. The car payment becomes the price of having transportation. The subscriptions become the price of having software and music and entertainment. These stop being financial decisions and start being line items, the fixed costs of a normal life. And once something is accepted as a fixed cost, it stops being examined. When David signed the truck papers, nobody asked him whether $53,000 felt affordable. They asked whether $689 a month felt comfortable. Those are completely different questions. One asks you to evaluate a total. The other asks you to evaluate a fragment so small, it can be absorbed into the background of a monthly budget without leaving much of a mark. Behavioral economists call the underlying mechanism present bias. Humans systematically overweight immediate experience relative to future consequence. The truck in the showroom is vivid and emotionally real. The payment in month 54 of a 66-month loan is nearly abstract, existing in a future so distant it barely connects to the decision being made today. The financing industry has understood this, implicitly and then explicitly, for decades. The entire structure of the modern consumer transaction is built around it. But present bias alone doesn't explain why people stopped noticing the shift from ownership to access. Something else was required, and that something was the way status became decoupled from wealth. For most of human history, the things that signaled success required actual accumulated resources to obtain. The signal and the substance were linked, because producing one required the other. Financing severed that link, quietly and permanently. David drives a $53,000 truck that he owns roughly a third of. His neighbor cannot see this. His neighbor sees the truck, responds to the truck, and perhaps, without consciously deciding to, adjust their own sense of what a normal life looks like accordingly. Sociologists call this social comparison, the process by which people use the visible consumption of those around them to calibrate their own sense of what is appropriate. What made this era different from every previous era of social comparison was that financing made mimicry easy. You did not need to earn what your neighbors earned to approximate what your neighbors appeared to have. You needed only to qualify for the payments. The appearance of the American dream and the financial reality of the American dream began to drift apart. And because the dream is always judged by observers who cannot see balance sheets, the drift was self-reinforcing, invisible, quiet, and mistaken consistently for progress. There is a measure economists who study mobility return to often. A child born in the bottom fifth of the American income distribution has roughly a 7 to 8% chance of reaching the top fifth as an adult. In Denmark, that number is closer to 12%. In Canada, it's closer to 13%. The country most associated with the promise that effort produces permanent upward movement ranks near the bottom of comparable wealthy nations on the very measure the dream most directly describes. The decades in which that mobility began deteriorating correspond almost precisely with the decades in which consumer credit expanded. Homeownership costs rose sharply relative to median incomes, and the subscription economy replaced durable ownership across entire categories of everyday life. Your grandfather spent 30 years paying for one house. You might spend 30 years paying for everything. David gets home on a Tuesday evening, park the truck, walk through the front door, drops his keys into the bowl by the entrance. Nothing feels wrong. Dinner is cooking. The kids are laughing somewhere upstairs. The television is asking if he wants to continue watching. His phone produces a quiet notification. Cloud storage payment processed. The truck payment clears tomorrow. Mortgage next Tuesday. Music subscription renews Friday. Gym on the 1st. Software next month. Insurance the week after. He stands in the kitchen for a moment longer than usual. Not because anything happened, but for the first time he notices something. Not the payments, the dependence. Every piece of the life he spent a decade building is quietly rented from somebody. The software he used to earn today's paycheck, the house he comes home to, the truck in the driveway, the phone in his pocket, the music playing from the speaker on the counter. If the income stopped, life would not slowly shrink. It would begin disappearing, one payment at a time. He looks around the room and asks a question that, somehow, in 10 years of building this life, never quite occurred to him before. How much of this actually belongs to me? The room doesn't change. The kids are still laughing upstairs. The television is still waiting. The notifications will keep coming. The payments will keep clearing. But the question is there now. And the strange thing about that question, the thing nobody warns you about, is that once it arrives, it doesn't leave. You see it at the grocery checkout when the screen asks if you'd like to pay in 4 installments. You see it at the car dealership when the conversation begins with monthly payment, and the total price is almost an afterthought. You see it in the software you have paid for every month for 4 years and own less of today than you did on day one. The American dream didn't disappear. It was divided into monthly increments small enough to be manageable, numerous enough to be total, and familiar enough that the question of whether something different was once possible stopped occurring to most people entirely. Because when the payments are normal, and the neighbors are paying, and the defaults all lead toward paying, and the entire system was built to keep you paying, the payments stop feeling like a choice. They just feel like life. If you're drawn to stories like this, stories about the invisible systems shaping money, behavior, and modern life, consider subscribing to Habit Wealth Stories. Every documentary begins with something that looks completely ordinary, a purchase, a habit, a belief, and then follows it until the hidden architecture underneath comes into view. Because the most powerful systems are rarely the loudest. They're the ones that become so normal we stop noticing they're there.